My name is Gabriel Strenger. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Jerusalem, and I do integrate spiritual and Jewish spiritual practices within my therapeutic framework, especially with patients who express interest in that way of integrating things. In my experience, many of my Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish patients suffer from what I've come to term spiritual dissonance. Coined, of course, on the basis of Festinger's classic term, cognitive dissonance. I define spiritual dissonance as a condition in which a person experiences on varying levels of consciousness a growing discrepancy between everyday religious practice and inner spiritual experience. In these cases, the religious tools provided by the halakha, by the Jewish law, aren't anymore or have never been experienced as vessels or instruments in the service of the person's spirituality or attachment to God. While in more severe cases, the religious practice actually becomes a hindrance to the person's spiritual and general development. As a rule, the more orthoprax the person, the vaster the potential of spiritual dissonance and the deeper the agony of the resulting feelings of guilt, shame, and existential emptiness. Psychotherapeutic exploration of these conditions often leads to the uncovering of the client's pathological object relations and or unresolved loyalty issues with early parental figures, preventing the maturing of the patient's religious identity. So here I'm about to provide a very brief account of some processes that took place in psychotherapy conducted with a Haredi, meaning ultra-Orthodox Hassidic man in Israel, here in Jerusalem, exemplifying the aforementioned dynamics and psychotherapeutic strategies used for unblocking spiritual and religious maturation. Mendel, I'll call him Mendel, he was 35 years old. When he came to therapy, he is, I'll speak in present terms now, he is a Talmud teacher in a yeshiva, married with many children, compared to the general society, many children, and belonging to one of the central Hassidic groups in Israel. He came to therapy because of his growing alienation from his wife, irritability in his relationship with his children, and general feelings of depression and emptiness. Soon after the beginning of therapy, the core issue underlying the aforementioned difficulties arise to the state that I have come to term spiritual dissonance, meaning a growing discrepancy between everyday religious practice and inner spiritual experience. At the time that Mendel began therapy, he was only partially aware of his religious doubts and spiritual emptiness. The very possibility of not being a good chassid, totally faithful to his rebbe, to his rabbi, and to his community, raised so much anxiety and guilt that he tended to suppress and partially repress the accompanying thoughts and feelings. But this avoidance came with a big price tag attached. Not only did Mendel live in a constant state of agonizing emptiness and guilt, but he had to reduce his functioning in most areas of his life to a superficial level, lest his doubts and his feelings would become impossible to bear. So he came to refrain of real engagement with his wife and children on the one hand, and with his Talmud students on the other. As a teacher, he wasn't able to generally represent the educational and spiritual goals of his own community. And at the same time, he also couldn't contain religious doubts or difficulties of his students and of his own children, since these only increased his own anxiety. My accepting and non-judgmental response to his first hesitant expressions of doubts about certain aspects of the Jewish faith and of his Hassidic lifestyle in particular decreased his anxiety and soon turned our weekly therapeutic sessions into the one and only transitional space in his life in which he could express religious doubt and frustration on the one hand and play creatively with new possibilities of religious experience and practice. The issues that he struggled with the most had to do with faith, not with practice, not with halakha. Generally spoken, he was harvesting doubts about the meaning of the Torah as God's word, as well as the goals of religious life and education. Certain experiences aroused his doubts, especially about divine providence, hashgacha pratit, especially in its more simplistic versions. When he was frank with himself, he came to admit that he couldn't believe anymore that praying fervently, as was his duty as a chassid, would exercise any influence on God and change matters in a simplistic, concrete matter. He also discussed with me his ambivalent feelings towards his Rebbe. On the one hand, he felt obliged to believe in the holiness of his Rebbe and even in the infallibility of his spiritual directions and decisions. On the other hand, being quite close to the Rebbe, he couldn't help noticing certain human weaknesses in his Rebbe's character. Now, in my view, there's nothing unique about the aforementioned doubts and questions. Every religious person comes to realize at different moments in his life that the kindergarten version of the basic religious tenets have to be periodically reassessed according to one's developing intellectual and emotional abilities. From a psychological point of view, the situation only becomes problematic or pathological when the natural maturing of a person's view, of a person's religious views also, come to a stop. In that case, the person develops a growing discrepancy between practice and experience, spiritual dissonance. In these cases, the religious tools provided by halakha do not help, do not give the person a sense of meaning and of attachment to God. As a rule, in these cases, it becomes the psychotherapist's job to lead the patient to an understanding of the psychological factors preventing the patient to engage in the natural processes of theological maturation and spiritual growth. So, in Mendel's case, what struck me at a quite early stage of the therapy was that already his father had been deeply ambivalent about his own Rebbe and his own Hasidic group. While raising the children in the educational system of the family's Hasidic group, the father himself grew increasingly close to another Rebbe, who was promoting a totally different path of spiritual life in general and a different praying style in particular. But, and that's the important point, Mendel's father kept this development to himself. He did not share his thoughts and his personal spiritual journey with his children, but instead he made cynical and at times angry remarks about their own community. So what we came to understand in the psychotherapeutic process was that Mendel didn't learn from his father how to work through inner conflicts how to listen to the different voices and feelings within himself. And not surprisingly, Mendel was even less able to share these processes of spiritual change and growth with his own family or students. The discovery in the psychotherapy of the very concept of inner conflict as a normal situation came as a big relief to Mendel. The fact that there are different inner voices that need to be heard and respected without impulsively act on them was totally new and exciting for him. So those insights opened up new venues of exploring spirituality for Mendel. Our discussions kindled his interest in Hassidic and other religious and philosophical literature that had evaded his attention until then. He came to redefine his own role as an educator as providing his students with a space for spiritual growth while engaging with them in philosophical discussions and trying to work out personal, educational, and spiritual goals for each and every one of them. With his wife, he became generally more open, not walking on eggshells, as we used to say, but expressing feelings as well as emotional and sexual needs, becoming at the same time more open to her thoughts and feelings. It turned out that his wife had always been more modern and open-minded than him, and that she had silently suffered from his inability to live more playfully, as Winnicott would put it, and more creatively. Of course, there were other aspects in this psychotherapy, which I cannot detail in this presentation, as Mendel's narcissistic vulnerability, his overly concern with public opinion about him, that also crippled his sense of authenticity and self-worth. Mendel's general frustration and his difficulties in self-regulation had led him to some addictive behavior with porn and food. But obviously, these behaviors were, among others, related to the aforementioned dynamics of spiritual dissonance. Not only were these self-indulgent behavior a way of self-soothing and calming the inner feelings of emptiness and guilt, but they also had a function to keep all these feelings out of his consciousness. So the more authentic Mendel could become in his religious identity, the more he could engage with his wife and with the other family in a more authentic way. I have to finish, so let me see what I'm going to say to you. Well, so to summarize, Mendel's case exemplifies the way psychotherapy can provide patients with spiritual dissonance with the holding environment needed to go through a process of psychological and spiritual maturation while working through the factors that had beforehand prevented the spontaneous reshaping of the religious belief system as it is supposed to happen in every person's natural development over a lifetime. In some cases, of course, these processes can lead a person to leave their Hasidic environment or lessening their religious commitment, and in my experience sometimes, in some rare cases, we have people leaving the halakha altogether. But these are rare cases. In the best case, and in my experience in most cases, especially if the therapist himself believes that ideally therapy should help a person find his way within his or her family and within his community framework, in those cases, psychotherapy with people suffering from spiritual dissonance helps them to go successfully through the process coined by the Jewish theologist Ernst Simon as moving from the first religious naivete, often through a middle phase of crisis, deconstruction and reconstruction to a mature state of spirituality coined the second naivete, in which the person comes to enjoy deep and meaningful spiritual experiences harmonious with the general intellectual and emotional maturity. Thank you.